Welcome to Tampa Bay Table Tennis, and today we have a special training video. Nick and I train with our coach, Gary Fraiman, at the Sunrise Table Tennis Club, and this is a longer video, includes multiple parts. There's the forehand warm-up, forehand topspin versus blocks, some backhand to backhand practice, and then a main focus on a backspin serve with a long push return, and then opening up with the backhand topspin. There are also some forehand topspin opens, and some varied play. Nick is a more advanced player than I, but I've also spent a lot of time practicing some of these drills, so it works out well for our practice. We've also practiced together quite a bit with our coach, Gary Fraiman. Nick plays for the UF GATOR's table tennis team, and he's the two-time North Florida divisional champ. Here's Nick doing some forehand topspin loops versus my forehand block. I'm trying to block close to the table, although there's a little bit of distance here, so it's not quite as early as it could be. Try to keep my wrist firm and the racket angle steady. Applying a little pressure on the ball to make sure it comes back down. Trying to keep the ball low and with some topspin to bring it down on the other side of the table. You can see Nick has a very consistent forehand topspin loop. Now here, I'm not really resetting in between blocks at the moment because it's a strong shot to deal with, and adding in the reset makes it a little more challenging, but you should also focus on resetting in between blocks at times. It's best when you have someone looping who might not be looping as quickly or as powerfully towards your top limit, so then you can focus on the reset and getting good blocks in. Now Nick is doing his forehand topspin to my backhand block. You can see it's a similar concept, trying to keep the racket steady, firm in the wrist and arm, catching it fairly early, but I'm probably a half step back here than I normally would be. Part of that is Nick's topspin loop. The other is that I was using my setup of Viscaria with Dignix 09C here, and I found that giving yourself just a little more distance made it easier to get the arc of the ball back onto the table. I've recently switched equipment, and I will speak more about that in a later video. I think it's important not to change too often, but sometimes you start to see that maybe your equipment is good for practice, but not ideal for the match situations you're finding yourself in when playing tournaments and so on. So here I am practicing the backhand block from a few different distances. I try to move into position, maintain, a fairly steady contact point on the ball, playing on the top of the ball, but also a little bit on the outside, depending on where I'm blocking to. Now we do a little bit of backhand to backhand warm up, typically starting with more of a flat contact, just kind of driving it back and forth, a little bit like a block, but with more forward momentum, early timing. Nick has a strong and consistent backhand. And then little by little, in the backhand practice, Nick will start adding in some pivot forehands. Something I realized recently is that while I use lots of pivot forehands in my game, I often neglect warming it up before a tournament or matches, so that's something I need to think about more often so I can put it into play more effectively. A lot of times I miss the first few pivot forehands on the day, so it would be better to have that happen while warming up or practicing rather than in a tournament match, of course. Some people use one big step or jump for the pivot. Other people use two small steps to get out wide. Kind of depends on your style and footwork. Here we're just practicing the diagonal forehand and then me blocking it back diagonally, so there aren't many changes at this stage of the training session. Typically, throughout a training session, you kind of start simple and then add various elements or increase the intensity or variation, so it all builds up. And the beginning of the session is mainly getting the feel for the ball, getting in the rhythm, and using the weight transfer and feeling the contact. And then later on, you start drilling some specific sequences that come up a lot in your matches, and then from those sequences you can add more variation as for example, where you might open the ball to the forehand or backhand side, where you might block the ball diagonally or down the line. The sky's the limit in terms of variation and practice. I spend a lot of time doing drills, so for me it's important now to kind of get used to the different sequences so that I'm not too predictable. Alright, here we get into the main part of this training video, which is a backspin serve with a long push serve return and then opening with the backhand topspin. You can see that Once Nick opens with the backhand topspin, we pretty much get back into the same groove we were in before with the forehand topspin diagonal. Like I said, you don't want to add too much too soon in terms of changing the drill, because you want to be able to focus on consistency at this stage. So there's a lot of repetitions here. I think, at our level of play and the amount of time we get to train, we could spend almost, well, not every training session, but you could spend tons of time doing this, and it still wouldn't be enough, because everything can change depending on who you're playing and the ball placement and the amount of spin on the ball, or things like that. And you have to have it pretty much automatic to get into the rally like this if you're an offensive-minded player with good topspin attacks. A lot of times people get into a match and they're happy to just keep pushing, but you have to practice initiating the rally with your topspin opens, so then you can find where your advantages lie. You can see some similarities between Nick and myself in terms of how we play. That's because Coach Gary Fraiman has trained us, and we've both done a lot of drilling under his supervision and guidance. There are a lot of important transitions to practice in table tennis. For Nick, he's serving and opening and then playing topspin, and that's very important. For me, it's pushing and then blocking and then getting into the topspin rally. Now here we started blocking down the line occasionally, and of course the first block down the line I decided to do this. My apologies. So we're still in this same training groove. Now when I block down the line, the first forehand, Nick often plays diagonally, right? So he's opening to my backhand, a couple forehands, and then I block down the line, and he plays diagonally, which is a common occurrence. If you block someone wide to one side, they typically play diagonally, but you can't rely on that all the time or become too predictable in that sense, because then someone will change it up and play down the line to the open space. So here, to focus on a mix of consistency and spin and power and footwork, not trying to kill the ball, not trying to miss too much, but still going for it and making sure they're strong shots, because you need to practice the way you want to play in a tournament match. So the practice is fairly static. You see I keep pushing to his backhand, Nick gets to open, and then we get into the similar rally that we've been practicing. So now, briefly, we had Nick do some forehand opens to my backhand block, because I need to practice this, especially the part about blocking it diagonally. Mainly just to improve my control against a very spinny open, because for my style, maybe it does make sense to block down the line with the backhand a lot to open up the forehand counter. Now this rally was great, and maybe one of the smoothest backhand counters away from the table that I've made up to this point. During this practice session, Nick was actually trying to change his backhand open up form a little bit, or at least experiment with a slightly different style. So you'll see some variations in it as he, tests it out. There are a lot of different ways to open up first backspin, depending on the racket angle or racket speed, and whether you're playing more up or forward. It changes the trajectory of the ball and the amount of spin versus speed and the trade-offs that come with that. So at my level, this is very important practice. Like I said, you kind of put together the push and the block and then getting to the topspin. Now Nick is doing a few backhand opens to my forehand side just to get the practice in there, the push, and then dealing with that. And I'm trying to block diagonally with the forehand, although that doesn't always work out that way. You see I'm trying to push over the table, also not using much wrist, trying to keep the ball low and spinny. If the ball sits up too high or not enough spin, then people can kill the ball, but if it's low and spinny, it's quite difficult to attack. Very good combination there from Nick. Offensive players will use that a lot. Here I am trying to recreate my backhand topspin glory, but it's not happening. As they say, repetition is key, and table tennis is no different. It's actually so important to just keep practicing all these different parts and then put them into use while you're playing your matches. And little by little, they will start to be more effective and more consistent. Here's a nice forehand counter. By me, you can kind of see how it gets set up. Block down the line, Nick plays diagonal, and then I counter the forehand there. My weight goes a little bit too far back and to the left. I have to work on that. Kind of going backwards a bit. Should be going more forwards. See? Here I serve a few and open a few. You can see Nick is strong at countering my opens. And this is kind of the next stage that I need to work on, is that after my open, I need to be ready for the strong counter, because it's one thing when someone blocks my opens, I'm quite good at following up, but when they counter strongly, or even kind of a medium topspin return, it comes back a little quick and I'm not ready. So I have to work on shorter follow through and a quicker reset and keeping my racket high, getting myself into position, expecting the ball to come back. Here's one where I open forehand to Nick's forehand, and it gets countered, and I was not ready. There's my backhand. We're playing a little freely here in terms of pushes and opens, because like I said, I need to get used to more variability. So just to reiterate, this type of training is very important for all levels of player, but I think particularly developing players in that intermediate range who are trying to be attackers. Thank you for watching. Please let us know what you think about this training video and what other types of things you would like to see in future videos.